Hey everybody, welcome to week 4 of the Doctrine of God class. This week we start talking about proofs for God's existence. And last week we talked about general revelation, specific revelation, and the fact that given that we have the ability to reason, the ability to come to conclusions, to make logical conclusions, that we can come to a conclusion using reason for the existence of God, that God does exist. So we will cover many of those arguments today, and there are some additional videos that I've added that go much more into depth of these views than I will, and they also give counter arguments to some of these views. So if you're interested more, you can look up many different arguments online. Not necessary, but you can if you want. So the first one we're going to cover is called the ontological argument for God's existence. And there's a video on this one. And basically what it says is if there is the greatest being we could possibly imagine, and then God must exist. So if we can imagine God existing or the perfect being, then that being must exist. There must be a being greater than our ability to imagine a God figure. And the reason is as it kind of concludes that there must be a God, and if there is a God, then he or she must be the greatest thing. Very similar to this argument, the ontological argument established by Anselm is an argument by Augustine, and Augustine's proof for the existence of God basically says, as we self-reflect, are we the highest being in the world? Like, I can think about myself and say, am I God? Can I solve the world's problems? Can I fix everything going on? And as I self-reflect, I can say, well, no, I'm limited. I'm a limited being, and I don't know everything. I'm not all-knowing. I'm not all-powerful. And therefore, if I'm not the highest being in the world, then there must be a higher being than me. And we can continue down that. So say you think, well, maybe there are aliens that are higher beings than us and very smart and able to do things that we can't yet. Well, we can keep going down that line. Well, are they the greatest being, most powerful being, the highest being in the universe? And you say, well, no, they're limited in this way and in this way. And we can keep going down that until we get to the end of like, nope, there cannot be a higher being than this one. That is what we would normally defer and call God. So that's his argument, is if we are not the highest being, there must be a higher being in the universe. So that was Augustine's argument for God's existence. It's very similar to the ontological argument for God's existence, slightly different. And then Augustine also has an argument from reason and logic. And his reason and logic argument goes like this. If there is something immutable and superior to reason, then God exists. So if I say my ability to reason out life, my ability to reason out God, circumstances, if that is the highest ability that I have, and for Augustine, given his time frame, reason and logic was one of those higher level virtues. And so we could put anything in this outside of reason. But for him, he was saying, well, if there is something superior to reason, and I would have to conclude, yeah, my reasoning is limited, then God must exist. His second point, truth is immutable and superior to reason. True. Truth, the true thing, my ability to reason is limited to as close as I can get to the truth about whatever it is, the objective truth about life, about the universe. So the actual truth of that, whatever it is again immutable and superior to my ability to reason about it. So, if there is something immutable, and superior to my reason, then there must be a God. Truth is immutable and superior to my ability to reason, and therefore God must exist. So that was Augustine's argument from logic and reason for God existing. Slightly different than the ontological argument, the argument of being, but very, very similar. So those are a couple of Augustine's arguments for God's existence. The atheological argument, this one is also in one of the videos. This argument, let me write this out. So atheological, so you know what I'm saying. The atheological argument for God's existence. Yep. There we go. And so this argument, what we will see in one of the videos is Anselm actually has a couple of the arguments for God's existence all put into his one argument. So you'll see some of those, and one of the questions on the homework is to kind of understand it and explain it in your own words. The atheological argument says, well, then every effect in the world has a cause. So everything that is happening, that has happened, that will happen, something caused it. Nothing just appeared out of nowhere. There was something that caused it. And so if you keep going back and back and back to the first cause or the first mover, we could say the Big Bang or the beginning of the universe, whatever that first cause was, that whatever caused that first, or whatever caused that first event or effect, we would say that was God, right? The first causer, the first mover. So we could say, well, the Big Bang started everything. Well, what started the Big Bang? There had to be something that created it. It just didn't decide one day, well, let a universe be created from this explosion of energy and material out of nowhere. Something caused it, something initiated it. And if we can't figure out what that is, they would say that would be God. And so that's the atheological argument, that there has to be something to start everything else. Now, we could argue, right? We could argue that, say, the Big Bang or the beginning of the universe, that first causer was a cosmic energy or a cosmic force. Whatever you want to call that, however you want to describe that first thing, we would deem that as a divine being. Why? Because that divine being would, whatever it is, energy, would be all existing for all eternity. It would also have the ability to start something basically out of nothing, and so kind of all powerful. And so whatever you want to describe that first thing, well, we're going to give it a name, God. I know sometimes we say, well, I don't believe in God, but yeah, sure, there was something that existed for all eternity before the Big Bang. Well, we're just going to put a label on that and call it God, or a divine being. Something that existed for all eternity, that was the initial causer of the effect. The atheological argument, there was a Christian theologian in Los Angeles called Dallas Willard. He's written a lot of really good books, and he argued that this was a good argument, not only for the beginning of the universe and this first causer, but was helpful in understanding that God exists and God's work through the world, right? So as something happens, there has to be a first mover, a first cause in our lives, and God existing. The next one, the theological argument for God's existence, and I'll write this one down so you can see it. Theological argument for God's existence. And there's also a video on this one. We'll explain a little bit more in case you want more information. The theological argument says there's an apparent purpose in the universe. If we look at the universe, if we look at material, we look at science, we look at the body, there seems to be some kind of apparent order to that universe. Now, maybe we don't know what order it is or why there is an order to things. The fact that we can even have a scientific process means there must be some kind of order, that we can conclude A, measure it, and determine whether or not A is true or not. That scientific process is because there is an order to the world. If the world was entirely chaotic, or the universe entirely chaotic, we wouldn't be able to measure things, because everything would be changing. We wouldn't be able to make conclusions. Mathematics wouldn't exist. Science really wouldn't exist. And so, whether or not we believe in God, we have to see that there is some kind of a structural order to the world and existence. Now, this inherent kind of design or structure to the universe, it can't just be happenstance. Now, we could argue that the universe decided to come into a symbiotic relationship in which there was enough balance that things didn't implode on itself. But then you have to go back to that first cause here and go, well, there has to be something to create that order, that structure, that design, the way things work. And if you talk to biologists or even physicists, a lot of them will say yes, that design, whether or not we can understand that design, there is unique, creative, mysterious design to our bodies and to the world that is there, whether or not they can describe it and whether or not they believe in God. Well, because there is this structure and understanding to the world, we would say that there is no real reason for this order. There's no reason outside of God existing that everything would have this structure. And so that was the argument for God existing. It is beyond coincidence that these two things would happen. It's just, I mean, it would take all eternity for, say, part of the cosmological argument, all eternity for the world to exist as it does. I'll get to that one in a second. Okay. The next argument for God's existence is called the ethical argument. Now, the ethical argument is very similar to what I had you read last week with C.S. Lewis and the moral argument. The moral argument and the ethical argument are very similar. And the ethical argument says, well, we are moral beings, right? There is an ethic in the world. We have an understanding of right and wrong, good and bad. Well, why? Why do we have an understanding of right and wrong and good and bad? If we wouldn't have an understanding of justice or injustice if we didn't have an understanding of there is some kind of good, there is some kind of righteousness. We have this understanding of good and bad. And in that article with C.S. Lewis, he talked about how if we were designed in our creation to just do the good, to help the person next to us, why do we have this conflict when it's obvious we should help the person, but I actually want to do the opposite? It would actually indicate that I'm not made or even not flowing in the way that I am supposed to in terms of my moral compass. And there must be some kind of moral compass that is greater than me. That's not just my own creation or part of the human condition, that I actually know all the time what is right or that I do it. But the fact that, well, there must be a perfect morality. Must be a law of ethics out there, a divine, God-like ethic of the universe, and that sometimes I'm aligning myself to that ethic, and other times I am not. But if I were just to determine all the time what is right and wrong and do it perfectly every time, then I could say, well, that ethic, that moral compass is so unique and individualized for me that I'm able to follow it. But the fact that I cannot means, one, I didn't create it. It's not just something that we have created as a culture or a society or the world. Because if we did create it, we could follow it. But we don't. We always do the thing we don't want to do. We can't do the good. We always fall short. We fall short in many areas of life. And because of that, because there is, if we look at the human story, the world history of the human story, it is broken. And so because of this, the ethical moral argument says, well, one, we have an understanding of moral and ethics because we can see and label what is good and bad, whether or not we agree with good and bad, whether or not we agree with those what is good and what is bad. The fact that we even have those concepts of good and bad shows us that, well, that concept of good and bad had to come from somewhere else, not us. We didn't create it. So one, the fact that it exists in us, and then two, the fact that we can't align ourselves with it, with what we would say is good or perfect or righteous. Therefore, that perfect righteousness must exist somewhere outside of ourselves. So those two things, the fact that we can see good and label good and bad, and two, there must be a righteous, ethical, moral system, list out there, then God must exist. That system must be part of who God is, or this divine being. It must be outside of ourselves, outside of the universe. It must exist somewhere. It's not just a theory that we can put on paper and go, well, this is the ideal, but it doesn't really exist. The fact that we can understand what is good and bad and try to wrestle through that means that ideal must exist somewhere. So that is the ethical, moral argument for God's existence. The next one is the aesthetic argument for God's existence. Aesthetic. The aesthetic argument for God's existence. The aesthetic argument for God's existence looks at the world and says, well, we have art. We can label something as beautiful. There are creatives in the world. Well, if the world is simply just a creation of beings trying to survive, that we're just fighting with one another for survival, the human instinct is to continue to live and procreate, then there is no reason for art. There is no reason for beauty. We wouldn't even have the concept of art or beauty. It would just, it has no purpose outside of, well, art has no purpose outside of pointing us to appreciation of beauty. It has no survival purpose. Movies have no survival purpose. Music, anything we would call beautiful. The fact that we can see something and reflect on its beauty just as it is means God must exist. There must be a reason way outside of just us existing or trying to exist as human beings for beauty to exist. There is no practical purpose for beauty and art. So because it exists, beauty and art exists in our lives, and we value beauty and we value art, then God must exist. And as we talk about next week, we talk about the attributes of God. Then beauty and creativity, some of these things that we can't explain, and must be actually attributes of the divine being. God must be beautiful. God must be creative. God is an artist. Because otherwise, why? Why would we even have these? The ability to appreciate beauty, to call out beauty, or to even make art. It really doesn't make any sense unless it is, one, God exists, and it's part of who God is, and a reflection of God in our lives and our culture. And oftentimes, we look at beauty, and I would argue that even the beauty itself, what we would call beautiful, is kind of an opening of a window to the divine, the existence of the divine being, right? So when we see beauty, say, and this goes back to what I talked about last week with general revelation. Say I see a beautiful sunset. I go, wow, that is pretty amazing. Well, why do I think that's beautiful? Why can I even call it beautiful? There is something about it that opens this window, per se, to my ability to go, wow, that's beautiful, because a presentation of something that is way beyond myself, way beyond me. Wow, and this divine being must exist. Something must exist that could create such beauty, such art, because I didn't create the sunset, but yet I'm able to appreciate it. And so the fact that I stop and reflect on it is kind of a window into, well, God must exist himself. And so beauty actually enables us to be in that process of reflecting on this general revelation of God within the creation. So that's the aesthetic argument for God's existence. The next argument for God's existence is actually the argument from evil, or theodicy. I'll write that one down. So theodicy, oftentimes, oftentimes people say, well, I can't believe in God because there's evil in the world. And this was, again, very similar, theodicy, very similar to C.S. Lewis in the book, in the chapters I had you read for last week. And he says, well, I would argue that, well, the world is unjust. There is bad things that happen in the world. Evil is in the world. Therefore, God must not exist. Well, in fact, the fact that I can call it unjust, that I can call it bad, that I can call it evil, means God must exist. There must be a counterbalance to that. I must have this image or this ideal of goodness, of perfection, of truth, of justice, that I'm comparing it to. Because if it doesn't exist, then I wouldn't see it as evil. I would just call it normal life. I would just call it what it is. And so people saying, well, I can't believe in God because there's evil in the world, bad things happen. Most of the time that's an argument not in a general reasoning. That's an argument based on experience. Bad things happened, nothing changed, and I can't really believe in God. And that's a hard process because we have to wrestle through our own pain and the limitations of life and our experience of that. And oftentimes that comes into our reflection of God existing or not existing, or the purpose of my life. Do I feel important? Do I have a role in all of this? And that's just hard. It's just a painful process to go through. However, the fact that we can see or label something as unjust, or even have those experiences of pain and lament, means God must exist. And so the argument of evil says, well, because there is actually something we call evil in the world, something we call not right, bad, then God must exist. There must be a God. And so part of the C.S. Lewis's argument was that, the sense of both morality, as we just talked about, the ethical argument, in combination with this theodicy argument, the argument from evil, that God must exist. And so C.S. Lewis kind of used both of those. And then finally, there's the existential argument. And the existential argument is a little weaker. We talked about existential 2 weeks ago. You talked about our experiences. How do we know what we know? How do we know that I feel what I feel? And so the existential argument is very simple. It says, well, people in the world have had experiences of a divine being. They've had experiences where they would label or know God. Because people have those experiences, then God must exist. Again, that's weak because we can have a lot of different experiences in life. We can have good, bad experiences. I can make something up of my own experience, and it might not be true. So it's a little weaker, but it is one of the arguments for God's existence. Now, finally, there are two very similar arguments, and there are videos on these as well. The first one is called the cosmological argument. And the cosmological argument was very similar to the teleological argument in that there must be a first cause, a first mover of the universe. Cosmological argument. First cause, first mover. And so the cosmological argument uses the first cause, first mover And then talks about the beginning, not just of everything, but specifically the universe. So, the cosmological argument says this: in order for us to get the universe that we have, the world that we have, the Earth being in the right position from the sun, any closer and we wouldn't have life, any farther away we wouldn't have life, all of the elements, the amount of water we have, all of it being conducive for life is extremely improbable. It's pretty much impossible. If you look at the numbers of all of those things, even if one of those things being in the right way to have life is pretty improbable. But if you put all of them together to have life on Earth, it is extremely improbable. And so the first cause, there must be a first cause of the Big Bang, of the universe, and then with that, all of the design elements to create what we have in the universe. So that would be the cosmological argument. Just everything has to be this guided process from a divine being, has to be purposeful. It is so improbable that we would end up with what we have and to have life. And then you have the Kalam cosmological argument, and there's a video for that, and a longer video. The longer video is if you want to know more and you want to hear the extended version of the argument. It's about an hour. Feel free to listen to it, but not required for the assignment. You can listen to the shorter video that I provided to get more information on it. But it says, whatever begins in the universe must have a cause, right? Combines the teleological argument. The universe began to exist, and therefore the universe has a cause. From this conclusion of initial cause and the universe having a cause, there must be a personal creator to this cause because of all of the elements, all of the improbable elements to be what it is in the universe. It wasn't just, even if that first cause was, say, an energy, that energy creating the universe isn't unique enough to create all the elements we have that are in the right way for Earth to have life. It's just, even if it was an energy, that energy would have to have intention and purpose to all that creation to get the world that we have. And so therefore that beginning cause must be must be a being, not just an entity, not just an energy, not just a thing, but a being. And that being we call God, a divine being, a being that has the ability to exist for all eternity, to create out of nothing, and to be intentional with all of those elements leading up to the life that we have. And so he explains in the video a little bit more, but that's the Kalam cosmological argument. And part of that argument, again, will go, people argue, well, maybe there was a pre-existent, like this cause and effect thing goes on forever, and part of the cosmological argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, argues that that's just improbable and impossible for an infinite series to even exist. And so argues why that infinite series is impossible to even exist in itself. So you can watch that video. In the longer version, he argues for that. So there we go. There are the arguments for God's existence using reason and logic. Now again, the videos will present a counter argument for some of these points of views. I just kind of presented them very quickly. And so watch over those videos, fill out the worksheet, and then again next week we will start then talking about the attributes of God, or this divine being.